One single event. A few buildings burned down in Manipur. And yet somehow it creates two completely opposite stories. One side calls it a necessary police action against illegal drugs. The other calls it a violent, targeted ethnic attack. So how is that even possible? How can both be true? Well, let's get into it. So here's what happened. On January 26, 2024, an armed Naga group, the Zeliangrong United Front, or ZUF for short, burns down a few structures. But the headlines that came out right after, they couldn't have been more different. The ZUF says, hey, this was an anti-poppy operation. But Kuki civil society organizations, the CSOs, immediately fired back, calling it a deliberate arson attack on an innocent village. And that, right there, is the big question we're going to unpack. We're going to look at how land rights, a long history of conflict, and the incredible power of narrative can collide to create two realities that just, well, they can't exist in the same space. Okay, so let's start with story number one. This is the version told by the ZUF. And from their point of view, what they did wasn't random at all. It was just one part of a much bigger and, in their eyes, very necessary campaign. You know, what's really fascinating here is the language they use in their official statement. Listen to those words: public alerts, peaceful compliance. It's the vocabulary of law enforcement, right? They're framing this not as a surprise ambush, but as the final step you take when all your other warnings have been completely ignored. So their whole argument really boils down to a few key points. They insist they weren't targeting people, they were targeting a criminal activity, poppy farming. They claim the land is their ancestral territory. And here's the kicker. They say the buildings were just temporary farmhouses, not a real recognized village. That single distinction, it's absolutely crucial to their entire story. All right, now let's flip the coin and look at the second story. And believe me, it paints a dramatically different picture. For the Kuki CSOs, this wasn't an enforcement action. Not at all. This was a straight-up, unprovoked attack on their community. And again, listen to the language. It's so important. Words like harassment, intimidation, and arson are chosen very carefully to frame this as a violent crime committed against a totally defenseless civilian population. And they're very specific, naming the place as Kangchup Songlung, which they say is a recognized Kuki village. You can see their story focuses completely on civilian suffering. They're talking about family homes being burned, people being blindfolded, their phones taken. They flat out deny any poppy cultivation was happening, calling the ZUF's whole justification a pretext for an ethnic attack. And then, notice that last point. This one incident is immediately tied to a much bigger political demand for a separate administration. So how on earth can both of these stories be true at the same time? Well, it turns out the argument isn't even about whether buildings were burned. Everyone agrees on that. The whole conflict hinges on what those buildings were. It all comes down to the definition of a single word. And this chart, it just lays out the massive gap between the two sides perfectly. One side sees a couple of temporary shacks used for an illegal drug operation. The other sees 5 residential family homes. They disagree on the legal status, the size, the very purpose of the settlement. They're not just interpreting the same facts differently. They're claiming entirely different sets of facts. To try and prove their point, the Naga groups pull out the law books. You see, in Manipur, the legal definition of a village is actually super specific. You need at least 20 households, and, this is the important part, it has to be officially listed in the government gazette. Their argument is simple. Kangchup Songlung, too, is not on that list. So legally, they say, it just doesn't exist as a village. But they don't stop there. They also add this whole historical layer to their claim, saying the land has been their ancestral territory for over 100 years. They say it was part of an old Impui Naga village that was abandoned way back when. So this frames the new settlement not just as illegal, but as an encroachment, like a hostile takeover of their historic land. And this is where we need to zoom out a bit, because this isn't just a simple dispute over a few buildings anymore. This is really about understanding how a story, a narrative, can be carefully constructed and then used as a powerful political weapon. So some analysts who look at these events see a recurring pattern, almost like a playbook. Step 1, you occupy a piece of disputed land. Step 2, you start using it for a legal activity, like poppy cultivation. Then, step 3, when the authorities finally crack down, you move to step 4. You reframe the entire thing as an attack on innocent civilians. This creates a powerful story of victimhood that you can use to legitimize the settlement and win political support.
Now, from this viewpoint, the suffering of the people involved is very, very real. No one is denying that. But the argument is that the story about that suffering gets transformed. What were the consequences of an illegal activity are suddenly reframed as unprovoked ethnic persecution. And that story, it becomes political fuel, used to push for much larger goals.
So you have to ask, right? Was this ZUF action really just a random, out-of-the-blue attack like the CSOs claim? Well, to answer that, we have to look at the context. We have to see what else was happening in this exact same area right before the incident. So check out this timeline. In the 2 months, just 2 months, right before the ZUF action, official state security forces, we're talking police and the army, were already conducting multiple huge raids in the very same area. Get this. In total, they destroyed 45 acres of poppy and burned down several farm and storage huts themselves. And this context is an absolute game changer. It suggests the ZUF's action wasn't some random, isolated act of violence. It happened inside what one source calls an enforcement ecology, basically a known drug trafficking area that was already being actively targeted by the government. This seriously challenges the narrative that this was just an unprovoked attack on an innocent village. But here's the part that makes you go, The story from the CSOs makes zero mention of any of these prior government raids. This is what's called strategic silence. Because think about it. If you admit there's a documented history of large-scale illegal poppy cultivation in the area, it kind of weakens your claim of being just an innocent civilian victim, doesn't it? And this really gets to the heart of the problem. When the state doesn't step in quickly to act as the referee, to say, okay, here are the facts, this is or is not a recognized village, it creates a vacuum. And in that vacuum, these two powerful competing stories are allowed to grow and harden until they become the absolute truth for their communities. So the crucial takeaway here is that this incident was never just about a few burned down buildings. It revealed something much, much deeper about how modern conflicts work, where the battle over the story is just as important, maybe even more so than the battle on the ground. And that leaves us with one final, pretty unsettling thought. What happens when we can't even agree on what's real anymore?